Every school has rules. Stay in class, don't wander the halls at night, and never open doors that are locked for a reason. But some schools hide things no one talks about. Empty classrooms that aren't really empty. Hallways where footsteps echo when no one is there. And stories that students whisper about but never say out loud. Tonight, you're about to hear true and terrifying school stories that were never meant to leave the classroom.
This happened a couple of years ago, right before school ended. It was the last day of 8th grade. It was exactly what you'd expect on the final day of middle school. Excitement and bittersweet goodbyes. Everyone was running around, scribbling signatures and cheesy messages in each other's yearbooks. My middle school was huge, easily over 1,000 students, so to keep things manageable, the teachers collected our yearbooks and passed them around to different classrooms, making sure everyone who wanted to got a chance to sign. I'm sure you could see how that could create problems. Anyone who wanted to could write whatever they wanted in anyone's yearbook. The teachers tried their best to prevent things from getting out of hand, but I knew a few kids who wrote some mean messages to people they didn't like. At the end of the day, when I got my yearbook back, I flipped through the pages eagerly, reading all the goofy notes from my friends. But as I scanned the pages, something caught my eye. There was a signature below the face of someone I had never seen before. His name was Samuel Robinson III, a name I'm going to remember for as long as I live. The message he wrote was short, simple, and honestly a bit unsettling. It read, "Hags, I'll be seeing you again." I stared at the page, confused out of my mind. I'd never even spoken a single word to this Samuel kid. It wasn't like there was anything I could do about it, though. The school year was over, so I couldn't see him even if I wanted to. I just chalked it up to some weird kid being weird, or maybe an honest mistake. Either way, I stopped thinking about it. A few hours passed, and before I knew it, I was at home hosting a sleepover in my basement with my best friends Kevin, David, and Kieran. The four of us ate Doritos and played Call of Duty all night. My parents' bedroom was 3 floors above us, so we didn't have to worry much about keeping the noise down. We were messing around on my dad's rowing machine sometime just before 2 when we heard a sharp knock at the storm door. The sound instantly silenced us. Who the hell would knock on the storm door? It must have been someone who either didn't want to wake my parents up, or knew we were down there, or both. It didn't make sense. The person kept knocking in the same rhythmic pattern. I could tell Kieran was about to say something, and I couldn't stop him in time. In a loud and assertive voice, he asked who was there. I wanted to knock him out. He had basically broadcasted to whoever was out there that we were down there. My basement doesn't have any external windows, so it was unlikely that they had known we were down there, but now they did. After a long pause and no more knocking, a muffled voice answered back. He said, "Come around to the back door," in a high-pitched voice that genuinely sounded cheerful, like he was a friend of ours trying to join the sleepover. It was definitely a teenager's voice too, and it didn't sound like someone who was pretending to raise their voice either. I was pretty scared, I can't lie. My friends were seemingly unfazed though, like they thought it was somehow exciting that some random kid was outside my house. They insisted that I at least check it out, and even though I didn't want to, they pressured me into it. We crept upstairs, careful not to make too much noise. I approached the back door slowly, trying to ignore the pounding in my chest. Through the narrow glass pane beside it, I could see a shadowy figure standing under the dim light. I got a little closer, and his face came into view. My jaw nearly hit the floor when I realized who it was. It was him. It was that kid Samuel Robinson III who had signed my yearbook. My friends went to go open the door, God knows why, but I stopped them, saying I knew who it was. I explained to them what had happened, and that changed their mood a bit. Keep in mind, Sam was still standing outside while we were talking, and he could definitely see in at us. He must have noticed how freaked out I was, because he started motioning to the side of the house like he wanted me to go over to the window. You might be wondering why none of us were taking this situation more seriously. I honestly think it was because it wasn't like some older, strange man was harassing us. It was a kid from our own school. Still, I wasn't opening the door for him. Instead, I went over to my kitchen window and cracked it open just a tiny bit. My friends followed me and stood a little off to the side. He walked over to the window and I asked him what he wanted, telling him I recognized him from our yearbook. He said, "Oh, so you got my message," and introduced himself as Sam. Then he went on to say he always watched me from afar and that we could have been good friends. I agreed with him just so that I wouldn't piss him off, but there was 0% chance I would have been friends with this kid given any circumstances. I didn't want to press him right away, but I had to know, so I asked him how he knew where I lived. He didn't respond, and I didn't know what to say. Before I could de-escalate the situation, David called him a creepy stalker and told him to piss off. Sam's smile disappeared. He tilted his head like he didn't understand what David had just said. Then, just as quickly, his expression twisted into something I can only describe as hatred. He went from passive and honestly kind of friendly to aggressive and angry. He started screaming things at me, how he hated my friends and thought we should all die, how my ex hated me and random stuff he had no right knowing. He reached toward the window and tried to force it open, but I jammed it shut and locked it. He started snarling at the window and banging on it like an animal. He was 2 seconds away from shattering it, I'm telling you. We must have caused quite the commotion because my parents came rushing down the stairs, demanding to know why we had woken them up. That's when Sam ran away. I told my parents what happened as quickly as I could, and my dad raced outside in his underwear. He came back a few minutes later, saying he had no idea where the kid went. I'm not sure why, but my parents didn't call the police. They just told us to go back to sleep and they'd deal with the school the following morning, just to give the kid the benefit of the doubt. The next morning, they contacted the school. That's when we learned the disturbing truth. Sam had been expelled a few weeks before the year finished, and he shouldn't have ever been at the school on the last day. Apparently, the yearbooks were printed before his expulsion, which explained why his picture was still included. That meant he had snuck into the school somehow just to write me that message, which freaked me out beyond belief. Despite working with the school to find out more, nobody could track Sam down. It was like he and his parents didn't exist. The whole thing was a pretty big deal, but the school did what they could to keep things under wraps. To this day, I still have no idea how he knew where I lived. That's what freaks me out the most. The running theory is that he was a mentally challenged and troubled young boy who took a strange liking to me for whatever reason, and then he stalked me for who knows how long. My parents were worried for weeks. It's something we don't talk about anymore because it's just uncomfortable, but living in that same house has never felt the same ever since. My friend Garrett is a little unhinged, and when I say a little, I mean a lot. He's one of those guys that goes around boasting about how crazy and aggressive he is like it's cool or something. He's constantly getting into fights, doesn't know how to keep his mouth shut, and spends more time in the gym than anywhere else, including his own house. There are actually 5 stories about him I could choose to tell, but the scariest one by far is the one you're about to hear. It also directly involves me, and I feel much more comfortable telling my own story rather than someone else's. This happened a couple of weeks ago, which was also coincidentally the last day of senior year, May 2019. The graduation ceremony wasn't scheduled for a few days, so even though we were done, we still had to stick around. It's tradition for all the graduating seniors to get plastered on the last day of classes, so that's exactly what we did. There's this huge clock tower in the center of campus where all the seniors convene to get drunk, which is exactly where we were at 10 p.m. It was packed. There were over 1,000 people crammed into that one courtyard. It was bittersweet, for me at least, but I think everyone was relieved at having finished finals, which are pretty tough at my school. There are a handful of other senior traditions I could tell you about, but I'm going to try to keep things succinct. There were 6 of us. It was me, C, T, R, N, and obviously Garrett. I don't think the rest of my friends would be comfortable with their names out there, so I'm just calling them by their initials. I should also really quickly mention that we lived off campus, meaning we had to walk through the city to get home. There are a decent amount of homeless people in that city, so it's not rare to encounter some of them late at night. Anyway, we were heading back home from the clock tower when Garrett did some Garrett stuff. Well, it wasn't really his fault, but that's neither here nor there. As we were crossing the street, some random homeless guy ran up to our group and started tweaking. Usually, the homeless people around here keep to themselves since they're all tripping on drugs and didn't notice their own surroundings. But this guy clearly wanted to engage. He He was just standing in the middle of the crosswalk, yelling things at us like he was a bridge troll protecting the other side of the street. We laughed a little and started walking in a wide semicircle around him, as we didn't want to piss him off or antagonize him. Well, everyone but Garrett, that is. Instead of disengaging, Garrett started yelling things back at the guy, telling him to get the F out of the street and to stop harassing strangers. The tweaker didn't like that and took a few aggressive steps toward him. That's when the rest of us jumped in to prevent an altercation from happening. We must have intimidated the tweaker because he stopped charging and went back to just yelling things. I pulled Garrett out of the street, trying to get him to behave, but he pushed my hand away. Before any of us could do anything, he charged full speed at the tweaker and screamed, "I'm crazy." The tweaker started running away, which caused Garrett to stop charging and start laughing. I know it's bad, but the scene was genuinely funny, as messed up as it was. It was like running full speed into a flock of birds and watching them scatter. We started walking towards our house after that, but after a few minutes, we realized the tweaker was following us. When he caught us looking back at him, he started yelling things about how we had made a big mistake and how he was going to, quote, call a niche, whatever that meant. We started heckling the guy back, hoping he'd get scared and leave, but I'm pretty sure we only intensified whatever tantrum he was having. Look, I'm not proud of everything that happened that night, but we were about to graduate from a very prestigious university and had been celebrating all night with alcohol, so we weren't in the right headspace to properly evaluate the situation. About a block away from our house, we realized the guy was still following, albeit a little further back now. I told the rest of the guys I didn't feel comfortable leading him to our house, and the other guys agreed. So naturally, Garrett took off toward the homeless guy before the group could come to a consensus. He again started sprinting at the guy, who once again fled in the opposite direction. Garrett turned and jogged back towards us, and we all jogged up the street. We thought that was it. We made it back to our house, pretty confident we hadn't been followed that time. I'm not even going to go into what we did back at the house. Let's just say it was a level of degeneracy I won't be approaching anytime soon. I can't even tell you what time it was. I was stumbling out of the front door to pick up my DoorDash when I noticed something odd. The side gate that led into our backyard was wide open. It was especially weird because we used this little strand of twine to keep it shut, so the door being open meant that someone had deliberately undone it. I instantly made the connection. It was probably that guy from earlier. I had enough sense to connect the dots, but I guess I didn't have enough sense to react accordingly. The smart thing would have been to alert my friends, but my drunken self decided to investigate. I put the DoorDash on the porch and went around the house, trying my best to walk straight. I turned the corner into the backyard, and before I could even see, I felt a rope around my throat. I flailed around wildly, but it was no use. Someone was strangling me from behind, and there was nothing I could do about it. I felt the rope's frayed ends digging into my throat as he tightened it with all his strength. I genuinely thought I was going to die. With all my might, I swung my legs backward, and he lost his footing. The two of us hit the ground, and I could breathe again, but he was still on top of me. In a fit of rage, he clawed at my face, and I could feel blood streaming down my cheeks. I threw him off of me, and he got to his feet before running out of sight. I'll try and keep things short from here on out. I ended up having to go to the hospital that night. The cuts weren't bad, but I needed a bunch of shots to protect me against any kind of diseases the guy might have had. The police were less than helpful, and since I was moving out a week later, there wasn't much I could do either. The worst part about the whole thing was that I had visible cuts in all my grad photos. Garrett felt so bad he ended up taking me to Nobu, but I never held anything against him. I just hope he's learned his lesson about not antagonizing people who have nothing to lose. When I was in the 7th grade, there was this kid named Sven in my homeroom. To put it mildly, he was a bit strange. He was one of those kids who didn't socialize with anyone else, even though people frequently tried to include him in things. I didn't have all my classes with him, but from what I remember, he would always sit in the same spot in every room, the back corner opposite the door. Without fail, he'd show up to school in the exact same outfit every day, cargo shorts and an oversized burgundy hoodie. He obviously didn't talk much, but when he did have to answer a question or read a passage, He had a really deep voice that lots of other kids made fun of him for. I don't recall him having any friends at all, which made sense. This one time, my friend Tyler caught him slicing worms during recess, which I'm pretty sure he ended up getting detention for. Speaking of recess, Sven would spend the whole period by himself next to the fence that bordered the woods. He never played any games or did anything even remotely kid-centric. He'd just stand next to that fence doing God knows what. Some of my friends claim to have seen him talking to someone on the other side, but I've personally never seen that, so I'm not going to spread potential lies. I'm trying to think of other things about him worth mentioning. He had several quirks and some other weird habits typical of any strange middle schooler, but none relevant to the story I'm going to tell. This happened on the last day of school. I went to a pretty big middle school with lots of kids per grade, meaning there were a ton of concurrent classes with students from the same year happening at all times. Because of that, there was this last day of school tradition where students from the same year would sneak into and sit in random classrooms to try and mess with the teachers. I'm pretty sure the teachers were privy to this and played along to amuse the kids, but that's neither here nor there. I don't remember the exact time this happened, but I do remember I was in one of the few classes I shared with Sven. Everything was exactly as it had been all day. The entire class was mixed up with random students that were supposed to be elsewhere. I was kind of a stickler for rules growing up. That's just how I was raised, so I never participated in any of the tomfoolery. My friends all did though, so I was often alone in all of my classes since they went to other rooms together. This was one of those times. All my friends had left the room, and the only kid I knew even a little, coincidentally, was Sven. Sven was acting stranger than usual that day. That's something I remember distinctly. I can't fully remember what we were learning or doing in class, but I do remember that Sven was tapping his foot pretty aggressively, something he never did. He was also constantly looking around the room, as if searching for someone or trying to keep tabs on someone. I don't think he was watching me, but I couldn't be sure. The other thing I remember was that there were a lot more kids in the class I didn't recognize. Granted, one or two wasn't anything out of the ordinary since everything was switched around, but the odds that there were so many students I had never even seen before were slim. At some point, the teacher, I'm pretty sure her name was Miss Bell, told us to get into groups of 3 or 4 to work on some kind of end-of-year reflection worksheet. Nothing serious. Most kids just used it as an excuse to talk and mess around. At one point, Miss Bell walked over to her desk, picked up the classroom phone, and turned her back to us. A few minutes later, another teacher showed up, I think from the room next door. They stepped just outside the classroom door and started whispering. It wasn't a long conversation, maybe half a minute, but something about it felt off, like they were trying not to cause a scene. I could tell something was up. Miss Bell looked uneasy. That's honestly the best way I can describe her demeanor. After they finished talking, Miss Bell and the other teacher came back into the room. They didn't say anything to the class. They just walked over to a few specific kids and knelt down beside their desks. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but whatever it was quiet, clearly like they didn't want the rest of us to notice. A minute later, those same kids got up and followed the teachers into the hallway. No one really reacted. I felt like I was the only one who even noticed what was going on. Miss Bell came back a few minutes later, alone this time. She didn't say anything about the kids who left, just sat back down at her desk and started shuffling papers like nothing had happened. But right after she did, the fire alarm went off. Miss Bell didn't really react, like she knew it was going to happen. She told us to line up and head outside, and we joined the rest of the school out by the field behind the building. As usual, everyone was grouped by homeroom, so I ended up standing with a bunch of familiar faces again. But while we were all standing there, I looked back at the school for no reason, just out of habit I guess, and I could have sworn I saw something move in one of the second-story windows. It was quick, and maybe it was just a reflection or a shadow or something, but it felt wrong. The school was supposed to be completely empty. I kept it to myself, but I was really scared when it came to re-entering the building. We never went back inside though. Before the alarm even stopped ringing, we started hearing sirens. A few minutes later, police cars started pulling into the lot. Not just 1 or 2, but a whole line of them. They didn't waste time either. Officers jumped out and rushed straight into the building. No one explained anything. Teachers just told us to stay calm and wait. After a while, someone came around and said school was being let out early. No buses. We had to call our parents. We were never told what actually happened. My parents ended up telling me what happened, or at least what the school had told them. They told me that a bunch of kids who didn't even go to our school had somehow gotten in. A rumor went around that they were planning to set the place on fire. Apparently, Miss Bell had discovered some very alarming tools in one of the kids' backpacks, and the school tried flushing everyone out with the fire drill. The details are still a bit fuzzy, so I'm hoping I'm explaining everything properly. The part that really stuck with me was what my mom said at the end, that the kids had been let in by Sven through the side fence during recess. The whole thing was so bizarre, it's still difficult to process even now. I never saw Sven again. I grew up in a small town in West Virginia. I won't share the name of the college I attended, but it was a small university in a little town about 15 minutes from where I grew up. I was a freshman in 2021, and COVID was still an important factor in my college experience. One of the biggest impacts was on the dorms. Most students didn't stay on campus due to COVID, so they rented apartments nearby. I was poor and didn't have that luxury, so I stayed on campus and drove home for the weekends since I lived so close. Still, I wanted the full college experience in the dorms. On my first day, I met my roommate. We had chatted a little over text because the school had given her my phone number so we could get to know each other, which I thought was a little strange. She messaged me first and seemed nice. Meeting her in person, she was still nice, but didn't say much, and she carried a privileged attitude. One time while talking, she said everyone has their own rooms due to a lack of students. I did last semester and now until you joined. I was a little taken aback and didn't know what to say, so I just changed the topic and continued the conversation. I told her I lived nearby and that I'd leave for the weekend on Friday and be back on Monday morning at 6. She didn't say much during the weekdays. She mostly stayed with her boyfriend in his dorm room. Now for the creepy part. The first Friday, I packed my bag for the weekend and left. I came back Monday morning at 6, just like I said I would. I didn't have class until 10, so I went back to sleep. I had a thick memory foam mattress, and after lying down for about 10 minutes, I felt the edge of the bed indent. I didn't move. I waited a minute, barely processing what was happening because I was so tired. Then the mattress went back up. That's when it hit me. Someone had leaned on my bed. I turned around and saw her facing the wall, presumably sleeping, so I went back to sleep. The next weekend, I left again and returned at the same time. Again, I wanted more sleep. Moments after lying down, I felt the mattress indent again, but this time it wasn't just the edge. The whole side sagged, and someone was sitting next to me. I didn't move. I lay there, frozen, and then I heard them get up. My bed was very high. In fact, I needed a step stool to climb onto it, and I heard them jump off. I held my breath, then looked over. She was again lying on her bed, facing the wall. I didn't know what to think. Was I hallucinating from the lack of sleep? Was it sleep paralysis? It couldn't be. I could still move. Could someone have gotten into my room? Impossible. We were the only ones with keys. I decided I must be extremely tired and just imagining things, so I went back to sleep. When Monday came around, I was really nervous. I walked in and saw her lying down, facing my bed. She was asleep, so I climbed into bed and tried to sleep as well. 5 minutes later, I felt my bed indent again. I squeezed my eyes shut, felt someone sit next to me, and braced myself to turn around. Then, I felt a hand on the back of my neck. My heart sank. I thought I was going to pass out. I didn't move a muscle. They didn't squeeze, they just held my neck. What felt like hours later, I felt them finally get off my bed. I still didn't move. I stayed frozen for a few more moments, terrified, then turned around. She was facing the wall, sleeping, but I didn't care. I left the room immediately and called my mom. I didn't go to class. I told my mom everything, and she reported it to the school. I was allowed to switch rooms, thank God. They asked if I wanted to involve the police, but I said no. There wasn't actual proof she had done anything. I just asked them not to give her another roommate. After unpacking in my new room, I remembered a few things. She had once told me that she had a previous roommate who didn't stay long, but she never said why. I also remembered one day she opened a locked drawer containing about 10 bottles of prescription medicine. She said it was for a skin issue. I wondered if that was true. Maybe she had another disorder or scary side effects from the medication. A few days later, I realized I had left a book and binder in her room. I didn't care much about the book, but she messaged me asking me to come get it. I told her I needed to focus on school in my new room, but agreed to retrieve my things to avoid suspicion. My key still worked, so I went in. She wasn't there, and I sighed in relief. I grabbed my belongings and turned to leave. As I turned, she was standing in the doorway. I hadn't heard her unlock it. I smiled, trying to stay calm. She didn't say anything at first. I walked past her to leave, then she asked, "Where's your new room?" I told her it was on the first floor. She asked which hall, and I lied. She asked what it was near, the stairs, the front, the office, etc. I said I didn't remember, but she kept pressing. I lied again, saying it was near the stairs. I turned around and left, never seeing her again. I thought about telling her boyfriend, but I was too scared. I still think about it. Was I dreaming, hallucinating? I don't think so, but it couldn't have been anyone else. Only we had keys. Maybe she was sleepwalking as a side effect of her medication, or maybe she was planning something sinister. My mom thinks she was testing how close she could get to me before I woke up, and that one morning, she might have actually tried to choke me. I don't know. It's in the past now, and I hope she never had another roommate again. This incident occurred during my time at university. I attended the University of Huddersfield from 2021 to 2023. It's not exactly known for its nightlife, so a lot of students end up spending late nights on campus, especially in the library or the academic buildings that stay open 24/7. I've never been the type to stay out late myself, but this happened during my last year when I had no choice. I was taking an advanced statistics class, and our professor was notorious for loading us with massive assignments. The due date for one of the biggest projects was approaching, and I hadn't made as much progress as I should have. My laptop had been giving me issues, so I decided to use the computers in the business building. The business building is a little isolated from the rest of the campus. It's 3 stories tall, kind of old, and it always had this weird, sterile silence to it, especially at night. But the computer lab on the 2nd floor was usually pretty empty after 9 p.m., so I figured it'd be the best place to focus. That night, I got there around 10. The campus was already dead quiet, and when I stepped inside, I noticed right away how much colder it felt than outside. I swiped my student ID, heard the beep, and the door unlocked. The whole place had an overwhelming odor of cleaning chemicals, which meant that I wouldn't bump into any of the cleaning staff, as they had already done their rounds in this building. I went straight to the computer lab, booted up one of the computers, and started working. For a while, it wasn't bad. The hum of the computer and the tapping of my keyboard filled the silence. I kept glancing at the clock in the corner of the screen, reminding myself that I'd leave before 1 a.m. But around 11:30, something weird happened. I was scrolling through some data when I heard the sound of a door slamming shut somewhere down the hallway. Not the front entrance. It came from further inside the building. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe it was just the air system or the janitor. But then I remembered. The janitors had already come through, and by now they'd be long gone. I tried to ignore it and kept working, but then came footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps echoing from the hallway outside the lab. They weren't rushed and they weren't faint. Whoever it was, they were walking like they wanted to be heard. I froze in my chair, staring at the computer screen, hoping they'd just pass by. But instead, the steps stopped right outside the lab door. I could see through the little window in the door if I leaned back, but I couldn't bring myself to look. I just sat there, holding my breath. After maybe 10 seconds, I heard the door handle being rattled. It wasn't like someone casually testing it. It was someone deliberately trying to scare me, like whoever it was wanted to open it but couldn't. My heart started pounding. The lab doors locked automatically after a certain time, so I knew they shouldn't be able to just walk in. But the way they kept rattling the handle made me feel sick. After maybe 30 seconds of this, the sound stopped. The footsteps started again, slowly moving down the hall until they faded away. I sat there in silence, debating whether I should just pack up and leave, but my project was due the next morning, and a part of me thought that maybe it was just another student messing around. I tried convincing myself of that and went back to typing, but not even 10 minutes later, I heard it again. Footsteps. Only this time, they weren't coming from the hallway. They were above me. The ceiling in that building has those thin panels, and you can sometimes hear the pipes when the heat kicks on. But this wasn't pipes. This was the distinct sound of someone crawling or dragging themselves directly above the tiles. I stared up, terrified as to what I would see. I could see one of the tiles shift slightly, just enough to know that weight was pressing down on it. Then came this slow creak, like someone carefully lowering themselves, trying not to be heard. I had enough at this point. I yanked out my flash drive, shoved my notebook into my backpack, and sprinted towards the door. The second I stepped into the hallway, it was like I'd walked into a different world. The hall was dimly lit by those buzzing fluorescent lights, and all I could hear was the sound of my sneakers squeaking against the tiles. I walked fast, trying not to outright run. I got to the stairwell, shoved the door open, and started down. That's when I made the mistake of looking up. On the landing above me, just one floor up, there was a man. He wasn't a student, nor was he a professor. He looked out of place, like his clothes were baggy and torn. His face half shadowed, but I could see his mouth was hanging open, like he was grinning really wide. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring down at me. I bolted. I flew down the stairs so fast I almost tripped. I slammed through the first floor door, and I sprinted for the front entrance. My ID card barely registered fast enough to unlock it, but once it clicked, I shoved it open and ran across campus without looking back. I didn't stop until I was inside my dorm, with my door locked behind me and my back pressed against the door as I tried to catch my breath. The next morning, I went back, only because I had to turn in the project. When I walked into the business building during daylight, it felt like a completely different place. But I noticed something that made my stomach drop. I saw one of the ceiling tiles was missing. The one directly above from where I had been working, along with the one from the corner, which is the tile I saw moving. It was as though someone had been watching me work, then proceeded to rattle the door handle to deliberately mess with me. And when they found the door to be locked, they proceeded to climb back up into the ceiling and enter from there. I dread to think what his intention was if he entered the lab before I ran. I think it's safe to say I'm going to buy a new laptop and in the future complete my assignments from the comfort of my own dorm. My name is Annabelle. I'm 20 years old from the UK, and this happened to me in high school, which is what we call college here in the UK. This was when I was 16. I'm about to tell you about the scariest day of my life. Sounds dramatic, I know, but you'll see why. So for context, my school had these lanyards with ID cards on them, and although anyone can walk into the building, you can only go beyond the foyer if you scan one of these IDs on a screen which opens the door into the school. The IDs have your face and name on them, but a lot of kids flip them around so you can't see their picture. You also need this to open up pretty much every door in the school other than for classrooms. Also, this was a fairly newly built school. It was really small but looked bigger because the building was pretty large. A third of the building was a special school for kids with learning disabilities. Another third of it was a nursery, and the last third of it was the actual high school. I had just started at this high school, and I vividly remember everyone being told on the first day to make sure not to let anyone in the school that we didn't know. The day that this incident happened, it was the second week of school, but this was actually only my second full day there, as I'd been feeling sick all week. I had geography class all day, and it was about halfway through the day when this takes place, about 20 minutes after lunch period. I remember drinking a heck load of juice that I got from the cafeteria at lunch because I had to finish it all before lunch period ended since we're not allowed drinks out in class, and I had nowhere to put it without it spilling over. So 20 minutes later, and yeah, I really needed to use the bathroom. I asked my teacher if I could go quickly, and we're not usually allowed to go to the bathroom during class anyway, so he was pretty annoyed about this since we only just had break, but he could see I really needed to go, so he reluctantly agreed. This is significant because at this point, nobody else would really be walking around the school. I never even really saw teachers walking around often during class hours. I left the class and let myself through a set of double doors into the cafeteria, and keep in mind, there was nobody in there at this point. I carried on walking into another large room with a second set of classrooms, used the bathroom, and let myself back into the cafeteria again to head back to my classroom. When I let myself back through the doors to the cafeteria though, there was a man sitting at one of the tables. It wasn't weird for someone to be in there. Like I said, people aren't usually walking around during class hours, but they still do. I mean, I was too at that time. I didn't know who it was that was sitting there. He was too old to be a student, so I assumed it was either a teacher or a parent, and I just continued walking. But then he said, "Hey," and I let out a squeal because I'm quite a nervous, jumpy person anyway, and I wasn't expecting him to speak to me. I was pretty embarrassed, but he laughed and said, "Sorry, didn't mean to scare you." This is when I realized he actually had a lanyard on, so at this point I was assuming he was a teacher. What I realized though when I look back on this is that even though he had his lanyard on with the ID part was flipped over so that the side with your face and name on it was facing the back side of the card holder that's attached to the lanyard. Like I said earlier, kids would do that all the time at the school. The scanner would still work, so it wasn't a big deal, but definitely weird for a teacher to do. I didn't really pay attention to this detail at the time though. "I need some help getting some work things out of my car. Do you mind coming out with me for just a sec?" he asked me. I didn't hesitate to reply with, "Yeah, of course," because again, I just assumed this was a teacher. We walked out of the cafeteria in silence and into the foyer and then out of the building, and I kind of noticed he seemed a bit nervous. Like, teachers usually make small talk with you when you're walking somewhere with them, and he was saying nothing. And also, he was moving his hands a lot. Like at one point, he had his hands in his pockets, and then he'd take them out and kind of hold his hands together. I'm really shy and not too good in social situations, so I didn't make any attempts at small talk either. With the layout of the front of the school, after we left the building, you've got about 50 or so meters, which is about 55 yards, to the car park, which you can't see until you're right next to it because there's a bunch of bushes which obscure it. If you walk straight on without turning into the car park, you'll be off the school property. So we were walking to the car park in silence, and then he suddenly says, "Yeah, my work stuff is in the boot. That's what we call the trunk of a car in the UK. He said, "I have a few bags, so I just need you to help me carry a couple into the school." I said, "Yeah, that's fine." We got to the car park, and he said, "My car is the blue one down at the end." And as we got a few meters from it, I could kind of see something in the back seat. And as we were getting closer to it, I realized there were at least 2 men hiding in the back seat. I froze, and instead of running away, I blanked, and I guess they saw that I could see them because the back door swung open, and all of a sudden, there was a man scrambling out of the car, and the man who I thought was a teacher grabbed my arm as I turned to run back to the school. This guy was pretty tall and large, by the way, and for context, I'm 5'2" and quite underweight, so I don't know how I managed it, rush of adrenaline or whatever, but I used all the strength in my body to yank my arm out of his grip and start running back towards the school. I could hear multiple heavy footsteps running after me, but thank God, they stopped pretty soon after I started running away, because my school had big glass automatic doors, and you have to just wait for them to open, and they definitely would have caught up to me if they kept going. I guess the fact that they were glass doors, though, would have been risky if there was someone walking by. Either way, though, I got into the foyer and ran straight into the open cafe, which was attached to the library, and I ran up to the person working at the cafe to tell her the situation. She calmed me down and came with me into the school to a teacher's office and called my parents and the police. There's security cameras in the parking lot, so they were caught and charged with attempted kidnapping. Also, turned out that man was able to enter the building because some kid dropped their lanyard outside the school, and that's what he was using and why he flipped the ID over. I didn't go back to school for a couple of weeks, and I'm still having therapy for this experience, but I felt writing this whole thing down and sharing my story would help me process things. This remains the scariest experience of my life.